all data, as I've just described, right, with GDP, it's constructed by humans based on their lived experiences, their biases, their lenses, all of those things, right? And so data itself is never a neutral construct.
From the heart of The Ohio State University on the Oval, this is Voices of Excellence from the College of Arts and Sciences, with your host, David Staley. Voices focuses on the innovative work of arts and sciences faculty and staff, with departments as wide-ranging as art, astronomy, chemistry and biochemistry, physics, emergent materials, and mathematics and languages, among many others. The college always has something exciting happening. Join us to find out what's new now.
I am pleased to be joined today by Joyce Chen, Professor of Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at The Ohio State University College of the Arts and Sciences. Her research focuses on demographic differences in labor market outcomes, the complex relationships between migration, climate change, and economic development, and the inter-household allocation of resources. Dr. Chen, welcome to Voices.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Well, I'm very interested in a transition story of yours. Yeah. So when you came to the university, you were in the Department of Agriculture, Environmental and Developmental Economics, yes?
That's correct.
But I introduced you as Professor of Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. You changed departments.
I did.
So what's the story there? Why the change in departments?
Well, I was very fortunate to have support from WGSS, the Department of Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies, as well as college leadership, both in my original college of Food and Ag and now in Arts and Sciences, to be able to make this pivot. So I want to acknowledge that and all of the support. I really made the move because economics was no longer able to explain the things I wanted it to explain. I had always been interested in economics and the ways that it looked at how people respond to incentives and sort of how market structure and institutions can influence those incentives. But increasingly, we're in this environment where we see market failure after market failure, and economic theory just does not currently have the tools or perhaps the will to address those, I think, in a more humanistic way.
And so you didn't want to stay within economics to bring about that sort of change. It's too exhausting to...
I'll share the story that sort of tipped the scales. As I had written a paper about the gender pay gap here at Ohio State University. I went through peer review at one of the leading journals for agricultural economics. And one of the comments I got back from one of the reviewers was the statistical analysis showed about a 9% gender gap between men and women. This is tenure track faculty at the university, and this was in 2017. And one of the reviewers' comments was, maybe women just don't like money as much as men.
Wow.
And that was the moment where I thought,
that's peer review, is it?
It is. And it was so frustrating because, of course, it's something that can't be falsified. You know, there is no evidence to definitively prove that men don't like money more than women. And so it just became very clear to me that it was an uphill battle that I was never going to be on the right side of within that discipline.
Well, it's interesting you said economics can't explain what you need to have explained. So, and now you're in WGSS. Are the methods employed in WGSS more compatible, or are you sort of developing your own theoretical framework to explain these things?
I think it's a little bit of both, right? So another example I'll give is with minimum wages, right? So economic theory has, and I think, every neoclassically trained economist would tell you that imposing a minimum wage is going to lead to job loss and fewer jobs. That's exactly what the theory says. We could show it in diagrams. I've done it, 100 times in class. But then we had several states and cities implement living wages. So where I grew up in Seattle, they implemented a living wage of, I think it was $25 an hour. And lo and behold, there was almost no job loss. And people are doing better with that minimum wage in place. And so this runs counter to all of most of economic theory, I should say. And we still, in my opinion, don't have a great explanation for sort of why our theory didn't work there, right? And I think there's much more about power and about collective organizing and all those kinds of things that we need to think about, as well as just the structure of thinking about how we distribute the surplus that's generated by workers, right? We think of Amazon as, sort of all of the surplus generated by all the delivery drivers and all the warehouse workers all go sort of to the CEO as the residuals. But there's a collective gain there from everybody working together, from having these huge shipping and warehousing networks, right? That it isn't just due to the CEO, right? It's the collection of all those workers together that we don't quantify in the correct way in economic theory.
How were you trained as an economist? Were you trained in sort of a neoclassical
Very much so.
approach?
Yes, very much so.
So what drew you to economics in the first place?
So partly it was kind of how central it is, I think, to a lot of the inequity that we see in the world, and being able to relate that back to economic opportunity or lack thereof, again, this gender pay gap, right, of saying, oh, well, if women historically didn't have access to the same sources of education, training, et cetera, no wonder they're not in super high impact jobs, right, like men are. No wonder they're not in the C-suite like men are. And so relating that back to, okay, what are the institutions that we can adjust? What are the economic levers that we can manipulate to try to correct some of those inequalities? And I still think that's very important. There's just also a lot of social levers that we need to think about more deeply.
So I think of economics as a sort of a quantified discipline, or as close to physics as any social science can be. Is that part of the challenge, you think? The sorts of things that you're interested in maybe aren't open to that sort of quantification?
Yes. Well, they historically have not been quantified in that way. And that's something I've come to recognize, as I've moved over to WGSS, right, is so much of the way we attribute value in our current economic system is about what can be quantified, right? So if we can't quantify a collective benefit or collective harm, right, even with air pollution, although we can sort of measure it, we don't make any attempt, or we make very little attempt as a national government, right, to quantify the harms of that pollution, and therefore to assign the cost of those harms to the polluters, right? And so I think really questioning, what do we see as quantifiable? What have we made efforts to quantify? How do we quantify things that historically have not been quantified, or where there are differences in subjective valuation?
I'm thinking back to my undergraduate economics. They were called externalities, I think. And we learned about them in like 1 half-hour lecture, as I recall.
Yes. Precisely. But it goes even beyond that, right? Things like actually all the work that we do in our homes for ourselves and for our families, right? Those, in fact, are not externalities. They have very tangible outputs and products. And
gardening and caring for children.
Exactly. Cooking, laundry, all of those things. And there's a fundamental issue, in fact, in the way we count those things, because when we purchase them as services from other people and there is an official economic transaction, it gets counted in GDP. When there is no official transaction, it doesn't get counted, right? And the mode of that production shouldn't be affecting whether or not it gets counted as some of the value produced within the economy.
Well, maybe this is a moment to talk about a course that you're teaching in WGSS called Data Feminism. Tell us about this course. It's a really intriguing title.
Oh, thanks. Yes, this is my new favorite course to teach because it really allows me to kind of reflect back on a lot of the work that I did and a lot of the things that I learned in economics and to put a feminist lens on it. So it is really just taking a feminist, decolonial, anti-racist lens to thinking about data and data analytics and acknowledging that data are not neutral. I think we, particularly in economics, have this, it's a bit of a conceit to say, well, the data tell us something as if the data are neutral and can tell a story free of context, which just isn't true, right? All data, as I've just described, right, with GDP, it's constructed by humans based on their lived experiences, their biases, their lenses, all of those things, right? And so data itself is never a neutral construct.
Say a little more about that, about how data is constructed, rather than just being something that an economist pulls out of the air.
Right. So there are a lot of questions about, who we're collecting data from, right? So even if we think about our national statistics, when we do a census, people who don't live in formal dwellings don't get counted in our census, right? There are also questions about based on immigration status, how we want to count individuals in the census, right? So one is, who do we think is even worthy of collecting data about? What do we think is worthy of data collection, right? So again, as I mentioned, right, we don't collect data on how many meals did you cook at home last week in the census, right? We ask about your total take-home pay or whatever it might be, right? And then also the way we code things, right? So recent change in census to actually finally have additional racial categories, right? Like Middle Eastern, to break out Asian Americans by specific ethnicities. That's all reflecting changes in our sort of priorities, who has a say in the design of these data products.
Given all these imperfections in data, how do we use such data? Or is that the point? We shouldn't use such data.
Oh, no, I think we should use the data. I think it is good practice to use data. I think what I would argue is that increasingly in this environment, and especially if we think about corporations and all of the passive data that's being collected through our phones, right, data is power in today's world. And so I think for humanists, it's really important for humanists to engage in discussions about data so that we infuse the right ethical principles and the right lenses when thinking about bias and, colonial practices and all of those things when we do use data.
So the students in this data feminism class, so what are they doing? Are they generating data? Are they studying data? If I'm a student in the class, what should I expect?
Yes, so it's a 2000 level class, so we don't get too much into data analytics, but they do have 2 exercises working with data, 3 actually. So 2 that are kind of more standard assignments, and they're asked to produce some graphs and some data visualizations, and then describe why they chose to create the visualization in the way that they chose, right? And how that might affect the interpretation or the reception of that data. So it's that critical piece of thinking about how your own influences, right, might influence the way you present something.
Give us an example of that, how choosing the way to depict or to visualize data can make a difference.
Yeah, so actually from this assignment, there's one piece where they're asked to show the gender pay gap between men and women in this hypothetical data set. And it's an hourly pay rate, so the gap is something like between $17.75 an hour and like $18.15 an hour, something like that. So if you graph that with your vertical axis going from 0 to 20, that gap looks quite small, right? If you graph it with your vertical axis going from 16 to 19, that gap looks quite large. So even something as small as just kind of changing the scale on which you're presenting the data really influences the visual impact of how you relate to that information.
It's like teaching students how to read a graph.
Yes, exactly.
What else can we expect in this course?
Oh, so the other really fun thing that we're doing is a service learning project with the Matriots of Ohio. So that is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that helps to increase women's representation in the political process. And so what we're doing this semester is working with some of their donor data. It's anonymized, and the students will be able to look through that data and generate their own visualizations to provide some insight to the organization about how they might better engage with donors moving forward.
I'm interested in some of your research projects, and I wonder if we might start with climate-induced migration in Bangladesh. Can you tell us about this research project?
Yes. So Bangladesh, of course, is, sort of at this perfect storm of potential climate disasters, as most folks know, right? With sea level rise, the land itself is sinking, storm cycles are getting worse, precipitation cycles are becoming harder to predict, and then, of course, upstream dams and things from countries upstream are also affecting water flow downstream. So with all of this precarity in Bangladesh, we want to see how much people are adapting by using migration as a coping mechanism. And I think migration is a really interesting one to look at because it's in a lot of ways sort of the last resort, right, of people. People in general don't want to move away from where they've built their lives, right? And so in one sense, it's the kind of, it is this last resort that we're looking at, but it's also can be a bellwether. And we're starting to see this in the U.S. on the coast as well, right? Folks who are moving away from coast as they're anticipating growing risks. And from a data perspective, it's also a challenge because it's really hard to track. We typically either collect data from folks in a place. It's very hard to collect data about folks who've left the place. And so this was a unique sort of academic and scholarly challenge, was thinking about how we get information on migrants.
How do you solve that?
So some of that is I was fortunate to be part of a longitudinal survey. So we're able to track households over time and where those folks have gone or left based on their connections with existing or pre-existing household members. We also started implementing some phone surveys where we would call people based on contact information we got from their household members and ask about their migration experiences and how that was going. And some of it was just following up with other household members and saying, where is this person now? And being more intentional about incorporating that data and thinking about the migrant still as a perhaps tangential member of that household, but not as in a lot of prior surveys, migration or other surveys, migrants are often treated as having left the household and no longer being a member.
In Bangladesh, you talk about people migrating as a solution to a problem. Mm-hmm. To where are they migrating?
Oftentimes they're going to larger cities, so Dhaka primarily.
Within
Bangladesh, yes. And that was actually, Bangladesh was a great context for this research because geographically it is a very small country, so we were able to track a lot of migrants in person as well. But yes, they're going to the larger cities, so Dhaka and Chittagong. There's also a considerable amount of migration to India, some to increasingly to the Middle East. But of course, tensions with India are making that migration more challenging as well.
Is part of the research to look at not just the fact that they have moved and to where they're moving, but what their lives are in this new location?
Yeah, so to understand how are they faring in their new locations? And there's a lot of research, and we're moving in that direction of thinking about migration networks. We know that folks tend to follow their friends, right, or follow folks in their network for migration, and that can help improve outcomes among migrants. And the other thing we discovered, again, because Bangladesh is quite small geographically, is that there's a lot of circular migration or temporary migration where people go to Dhaka from the countryside and they work in the city and come home to the village maybe once or twice a month. Right, so they have not quite a full household in the city, right? Many of them are domestics or working in factory settings where they have housing provided by employers. And so they would come home to the villages a couple of times a month or several times a year. And so this is kind of a liminal space of, this is different than, say, for us, college students who move out of their parents' house after they graduate kind of thing, ideally. But much more like a consistent, almost a commuter type situation. And so trying to understand the parameters of how that works and how people continue to engage with their other household members when they're doing that kind of circular migration.
You mentioned climate migration in the United States. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if this has been part of your research, but to where are U.S. climate migrants moving? Just away from the coasts, or?
That seems to be, yes. It's a very interesting scenario in the U.S. where, this is true, I guess, throughout the world, right? It tends to be very bifurcated. Folks who are living in environmentally precarious areas are either very high income, right, have lovely homes on stilts on the beach, or very underprivileged, right, are renters in very precarious housing environments. And so we see different modes of migration, right? Oftentimes there's what's called like a trapped population dynamic, right? With folks who are lower income don't have the resources to move away from that kind of risk versus the exodus of wealthier households who no longer want to be engaged with that kind of risk.
You just raised this, and I know that part of your research shows that climate pressures in Bangladesh influence migration, but the magnitude can be modest because especially the poorest households oftentimes can't move. How does that reshape the narrative of inevitable mass climate migration?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so I think we're really struggling with this tension between what folks call managed retreat, where we try to manage a retreat of populations proactively out of environmentally risky area versus thinking about how we deal with a catastrophic event. And this we find also relates to migration, right? That a lot of migration occurs in response to kind of one-off events, right? A couple of bad floods or a couple of bad crop cycles. We really don't have a lot of historic evidence, or we're not able to extrapolate from historic events as to what might happen in a catastrophic circumstance.
You mentioned the phone-based surveys that you've used. I'm interested in other methods in this research, and in particular, I know you use remote sensing environmental data. I'd like to hear more about these data and some of the other methods that you employ.
Yeah, so that was with collaborators in the School of Earth Sciences. We used remote sensing data that allows us to identify when water is covering the land area and also to identify the density of vegetation. So we can attempt to infer flooding events with that data and also how well crops are doing within an area. And that was also very interesting, brought me to this question of data objectivity, right? And in some sense, that kind of satellite imagery seems very objective, right? It is a picture and the pixel is green or the pixel is red. But the way in which we interpret it actually is much, there's a lot more to unpack in the way we interpret that. Right?
Like what?
Like thinking about, so this was something I had to work with my earth sciences colleagues on, right? Was, okay, if this pixel is water today, how do I know that this is flood water versus a lake that's already been here, right? And so how would I adjust for existing bodies of water versus what is new water, right? Of like, is this a flooding event where there's been inundation that wasn't there before, right? And also questions about how frequently does the satellite imagery update, right? So if we have a very quick flash flooding event, oftentimes satellite imagery isn't going to pick that up because it doesn't come through frequently enough, right? You really need it on an hourly or a daily basis, right? Rather than on an 8-day cycle, as many of the images are.
How did your earth sciences colleagues respond to your queries?
They were very accommodating, but it was interesting to see that we had very different perspectives coming to it. I think in the way I understood the earth science context, it was they were much more concerned about accuracy, right? So sort of, okay, we constructed this measure based on the color of the pixels and other, processing effects, and then we ground truthed it. And so, we, against the 3 periods of time or, 3 dates where we ground truth this measure performed really well.
And ground truth means we're actually seeing what's on the ground, not just from the satellite images. Exactly.
So using physical measurements or observation. Versus from a social science perspective, we were much more interested in to what extent does this capture the experience of people on the ground, right? It's great that the measure is accurate, but if that's not what's relevant to people on the ground, we have to kind of finesse that.
So they didn't roll their eyes at you?
No. Well, not in front of me.
Well, I'm interested in another migration project that you've worked on, understanding short-term migration. So tell us about this research project.
Yeah, so this is, as I mentioned, related to that idea of circular migration. Yeah. And when are people making this choice to engage in short-term migration versus a permanent move? I think it's quite common, right? In fact, even in our own context, we could think of, or in the U.S. context, we could think of college as being a short-term migration for a lot of folks, right? Or maybe you take a job for a couple of years in San Francisco and then you find a more reasonably priced place to live, right? And so just kind of trying to understand those dynamics of who goes along on those migration episodes, what kind of relocation is happening, how do resources flow between the migrant and the household that they're coming from and the area that they're originating from. We have a lot of these discussions, even in the current context, thinking about immigrants and immigration, right, or where are remittances going, how much money is being remitted as opposed to staying in the U.S. economy. So all of that, I think, is even more relevant in the context of circular migration or temporary migration than in the context of permanent migration, where you have a little bit more separation between the household and the migrant.
And this study is larger than just Bangladesh. Is that correct?
It's been focused primarily on Bangladesh.
Oh, okay. Mm-hmm. I don't know how I want to ask this, so I'll just ask it.
Yeah.
Do people choose to migrate, or is it a choice that's sort of foisted on them?
I would say it's a spectrum. So we do have people who choose to migrate where, they have the most agency, right? And so, I chose to come here to Ohio State, right, from where I was. And at the other extreme, we have folks who are either entirely trapped and can't move when they want to move, or are forced out and have to move when they don't want to.
I'm curious to know what drew you to economics in the first place. Did you know when you were, 4 years old, you were going to be an economist, as opposed to, a violinist or a basketball player? I don't know. Why economics?
Really, because of how much I saw it was tied to inequalities, really, and disparities across groups and across individuals, right? And explaining how changing those economic opportunities or shifting what's available to folks can shift outcomes. Increasingly, I think that has to be enriched by also thinking about how shifting those opportunities without shifting our underlying institutions and societal factors is insufficient.
So you're going into economics when you went to university. You knew it was economics.
Well, no, actually, I started out wanting to be a women's studies major.
Oh, okay.
My parents were not so thrilled about that. And so I'm delighted that I've been able to come full circle and back to women's studies now.
Tell us what's next for your research. What are you working on now? What's next?
So now I've been kind of, retooling since I joined women's studies. And I should say in between my time in Ag Econ and women's studies, I did take a couple of years off to work in Amazon in their corporate HR space. So doing research looking at, again, differences across demographic groups and HR outcomes and how we might be able to mitigate those. So I'd love to take some of those learnings and bring them back here into my research, and also to work more with nonprofits. I sit on a few different boards now in the Columbus community, and to bring those learnings to boards and think about how I can help them with research. I think among economists, there's what publishes well is oftentimes not the research that's needed for folks to make better decisions within their organizations and even within their lives. And so I'd like to be able to spend more time focusing on research that's going to be impactful.
Has your research ever led to a policy intervention of some kind?
I can't say directly. I do know that the university did, I believe 2 years ago, make some efforts at looking at pay equity among tenured faculty. And so there were some equity adjustments provided in that case, which I would like to think was related to my research, but was never told that.
And we have come full circle. Joyce Chen, thank you.
Thank you.
Voices of Excellence is produced and recorded at the Ohio State University College of Arts and Sciences Marketing and Communications Studio. More information about the podcast and our guests can be found at go.osu.edu/voices. Voices of Excellence is produced by Doug Dangler. I'm Jen Farmer.